ecologists, just a whole lot of different people together. So I'm representing this part of the team today, and I'll give a little bit of background on the project. First off, why are we talking about prairie in the first place? Why are we talking about putting prairie or integrating that into a row crop scenario? It's perennial, so that means it comes back year after year from the roots. It has deep roots. You can see from the graph on the right side of the screen, compared to some of the annual row crops like corn and soybeans that we plant across much of the Midwest, the roots go significantly deeper. When we have large rainstorms, the prairie plants, both the stems of the grasses and the forbs of the flowers, stay upright and don't convey water as easily as something like a brome or some of the introduced grasses do. It's diverse, so there's a lot of different species of grasses, flowers, legumes, sedges, things like that, that provide a whole lot of habitat for native species, so things like pollinators and mammals and birds and just a variety of other things. So that's kind of why we're talking about prairie. Back in 2004, there was a group of researchers at Iowa State that got into thinking about what would happen if we took a small amount of prairie and we integrated that back into the landscape in a row crop situation. These initial studies took place at the Neil Smith National Wildlife Refuge at Prairie City, which is, for those of you not from Iowa, it's about 30 or 40 minutes east of Des Moines in central Iowa. And it's a really neat facility. There's about 5,000 or 6,000 acres of prairie. They have some ag land, and that's where the study was taking place. This is a little bit of an example of what it looks like, or one of the fields. You can see here, we had a few different treatments. So we had 100% corn. We tried 10% prairie all at the bottom of the field, or the toe slope. Then we tried 10% of the field that was both in a buffer at the bottom, and then, as you can see, in these contour strips. And then we also tried 20%. This field would be an example of what a 10% prairie. You can see this little white thing here is what's called a hydrologic flume. It's essentially a funnel. So the engineering department that is part of the team at Iowa State, they placed these flumes in the lowest point of the watershed where all the water would be flowing to. So you can see here, so this would monitor water flow, and then it would monitor the sediment, the nutrients, and everything that's coming through that flume. And we can take measurements from there and then compare all these different treatments. So you can see here, this is an example of one 4-inch rain event in June. This happened to be this is a picture from 2008, but in the field that was 100% crop. All the fields were managed the same. They were all managed under a no-till situation. So there's no tillage occurring. And you can see from one 4-inch rain event, I mean, some of this, the best topsoil in the world is flowing off of this field in one rain event. So that's been a really good teaching tool, working with the farmers and the landowners down here to see what can really happen and what's going on your field. So some of the fields that we have the flumes on. We had another control site that was 100% prairie. You can see there's clear water flowing out of the edge of this flume. Really nice. Now, obviously, 85% of the state of Iowa was covered with tallgrass prairie about 200 years ago. We can't go back to that because the corn and soybeans really makes up the backbone of the economy here in Iowa. But now look, if you have just 10% of that field in prairie, the remaining 90% stays in row crop. You're still losing some soil, but there's a dramatic reduction as you look from left to right across the screen. And by just, again, strategically placing that 10% of prairie, you can receive a disproportionate amount of benefits. So beyond just the nutrient movement and the soil, here's kind of some of the highlights, and all of this information is available in peer-reviewed journals that you can find on our website and other places around the internet. But you had, 37% reduction in water runoff, 95% reduction in sediment loss, 77% reduction in phosphorus runoff, and then jumping down through some of this stuff. 3 times the amount of pollinators, twice the amount of birds, cheaper than installing terraces and comparable to cover crops. So, you know, some of those numbers and reduction in soil and reduction in nutrient movement are really staggering. And I understand 10% is a large amount to take out of a field. But again, you're seeing those disproportionate benefits and you're getting benefits to more than just one thing. We started to expand beyond that initial research study after, you know, looking at that for about 10 years and realizing that we were seeing positive results. There were a lot of farmers and landowners around Iowa and other spots in the Midwest that were interested if they could integrate this into their field. So that was kind of where I came into the project back at the beginning of 2014 and started putting these on different fields, commercial fields, large fields, you know, regular farm fields all around the Midwest. So you can see, you know, it's kind of a concentration in Iowa. There's a lot here in the Wisconsin area because of the work that the Sand County Foundation is doing, and keeps getting more and more popular. Another important thing to mention is this has received enough traction that it became part of the Farm Bill in 2018. So essentially what that means is there is funding available for prairie strips. It's called the CP43 practice through the Conservation Reserve Program. So if you contact your local USDA office that's in your county, your USDA service center, you'd be able to receive cost share for putting in prairie strips. How can this look on the farm? Well, there's really a lot of flexibility to it, and that's one of the really, really nice things about prairie. It can be these strips on the contour through the field, but you can have buffers on the edge of field that do a really good job of filtering that surface flow before the nutrients and the water leave the field. If you can see on the kind of the north side of this picture, up at the top here, there was kind of a small area that was between the edge of field and a waterway. So you can eliminate some of those point rows and create more efficiency by taking some of that land out of production. So you're not doing all these little short rows and turning around the combine or turning around the planter or any implement that you have in the field. This large strip moving through the field here, it actually gets wider as it moves to the south. Essentially what we were doing was creating uniform farming lanes on either side of that. So there was an even number of passes and spacing the strips in a way that work with the equipment that the farmer is using, specifically the planter and then the sprayer. This is something that people think about prairie strips, you're probably envisioning, well, it's something more like this. And this is absolutely something that you could do, you know, laying strips out on the contour throughout a field to, again, work with that farmer's equipment, but then you're intercepting that water flow and you're keeping soil in place in the field. But then you're also creating all these bands of habitat for pollinators, for birds, for small mammals. It doesn't necessarily have to mean a strip. You know, the term strips can be a little bit confusing, but it's just about integrating prairie into a row crop setting. So, you know, here looking at a contour map, what does this mean? Well, essentially this is a relatively flat field, but there's no way that you could achieve a contour farming setup and not drive the farmer crazy if you're going to put contour strips in here. So what we ended up with here was an edge of field buffer, and these can also be really effective, basically acting as that last line of defense that's keeping your soil, which is your infrastructure, on your property, keeping those nutrients on your property and creating some really good habitat. You can see here on the left side of the screen, there's some larger blocks of prairie. And I wish that we were all sitting in a room together because I would love to ask folks what they think those are. Why we did that? Well, I'll just show you because we don't have a lot of time. Essentially, water doesn't flow evenly over the field or over the surface of the earth. So you have some areas where there's more flow going to a certain part than others. And through a design like this, you can maximize the amount of the field that is still in row crop production. And these wider areas are actually draining more of the field. So again, keeping areas where you don't need a long linear uniform buffer, you can vary the width of that buffer to maximize the amount of filtration that you're doing while also maximizing the amount of land that's still in row crop. So things to keep in mind, strips are part of the USDA CRP program. that's very interesting to farmers and landowners. They can really be applied in a variety of ways depending upon land characteristics, landowner goals, and a small amount of prairie can create disproportionate benefits for soil retention, nutrient export, wildlife and biodiversity, and then a return on investment when you're converting low producing acres or wet spots, dry hillsides, things that are shaded by adjacent trees, things like that. So if anybody has more questions, please check out prairiestrips.org. You can email prairiestrips@iestate.edu, and myself or someone else on the team will get back to you. And then we've got a couple spots on the social media that you're more than willing to check out. All right, that's what I have. I think I tried to stay close to the 10 minutes, but if folks have questions, yeah, please put them into the chat box. And then Craig, I don't know if we want to try and deal with some of those now or if we want to keep moving along.
Yeah, let's go ahead. So just a reminder, we've got a couple questions in the chat and we'll answer those, but please use the Q&A if you can access it at the bottom. And we did, in the chat, we did post a couple of links like to the Iowa State Strips website and the CRP program website for that practice that Tim mentioned. So you will find those web links in the chat. So we have a question here that asks, is herbicide drift an issue?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's one, if would have had a little more time, there's kind of some frequently asked questions that I generally would get into. And that's one of them, absolutely. So all of these farms, I think we're sitting at about 60 farms or so now. Most of them are what you consider conventional farms. They're using herbicide, they're using seed treatments, they're using all these things. We've still found large amounts of native bees, large amounts of honeybees in the places where you have bee boxes. Anyway, we're seeing no real effect to wildlife, but you still have to be conscientious of spray drift. You have to be conscientious of what are the conditions. Oh, see, my internet's getting wonky. I hope all you guys can hear me. Anyway, just being conscientious of the conditions when you spray. So keeping your booms low, watching wind speed, things like that. During the establishment period for the prairie strips is going to be the worst time to worry about drift. But what we found is the prairie is mature. Again, they have those deep roots, and unless they're directly sprayed, the leaves may curl, they may not bloom, they may kind of get stressed, but they will come back from the roots the following year. So drift is a little bit of an issue, but unless the boom is put directly over the strip, it's not going to kill the prairie plants.
Okay. And I'm going to go through these kind of quick. And just so people know, we will offer to stay on after 9 a.m. if you want to continue with some questions we don't get to. Another question is, can we use strips as an alternative to grass waterways?
So they're serving two different functions. The waterway is designed to convey water off the land. The strip is going to be perpendicular to the flow of water. You're basically intercepting that surface flow as it moves through the field. What we found is that having a combination of the two is probably going to be the best thing. We don't encourage people to tear out their waterways if they're going to put in prairie strips. Essentially, like I mentioned before, the strips are going to have these stiff upright stems that are going to stay upright during a rain, where you think about the brome or the fescue or the other things that are in your waterway are typically going to flop over and convey that water. If you start to make it harder for water, water doesn't care. It just wants to get downhill. It'll basically hit the edge of that prairie strip if you put that into a waterway situation, and it'll begin cutting on the outside of the waterway and short-circuiting the waterway. So they're kind of two different functions. And we found that they work well together, and having both would extend the life of both practices. And again, like we always say, having multiple conservation practices, cover crops, prairie strips, contour farming, all this stuff is going to be better than any one thing on its own.
And I'm going to jump to a related question. It asks, over time, wouldn't soil accumulate in the prairie strips and create a dam or a terrace?
Yeah, you would think that. And, the strips that are at Neil Smith, they were planted in 2007, and that's been the oldest strips that we have. And you don't really necessarily see that. This, again, a question that we get all the time. But what we're looking into now is actually terminating some of those strips that are at Neil Smith and then moving them either up or down the hill and then looking at the microbial community and seeing how quickly new benefits or how quickly these benefits to wildlife and soil microbes and everything accumulate under the new strip, and then how long benefits to the crop will stay, in the area where the prairie strip was moved. So again, one of the neat things about this, maybe you enter into a 10-year contract with CRP, you're not pouring concrete out there. It's like these things, they are pretty rugged species, but they can be terminated and they can be moved at any time. And then hopefully we'll see that the benefits last for a few years where the strip is moved, and then you'll quickly accrue new benefits under the new prairie strip.
Okay, and we have time for one more question. I'm going to ask for a 20-second answer, and I know you have a quick answer. How do we manage tree growth, and is burning allowed?
Yeah, tree growth, so the succession is a very, very powerful thing. Trees are always going to want to invade grasslands. Yeah, burning is something that we allow, and it's encouraged. Again, get yourself some experience. Don't just go out and burn without any experience, but it is something that we encourage starting in about spring of the third year. So yeah, burning is a phenomenal management tool for prairie, and it can really help keep those tree seedlings out.
Great. Okay. And again, we'll continue to do Q&A after 9 if anyone wants to stick around, but now we're going to jump. Thank you very much, Tim, for your time. And Tim will stay with us for the hour. We're going to jump to our first farm, Dan Stoffel. We have a pre-recorded video in the field where we could control the wind and all those things. And it's about 12 minutes long, and we're just going to jump right to it.
Our farm has been in the family since the late 1870s, and now we farm about 800 acres with my brothers. It was a dairy farm up until about 10 years ago when we made the decision to lighten our load a little bit. So we segued into raising Holstein steers, and then we segued out of that in about 2 years ago. So now we raise crops, mostly alfalfa, soybeans, corn, and a little bit of oats. My grandpa was a fairly active conservationist way back. We have some of the oldest terraces in Wisconsin. They were built with WPA money during the Depression. But contour farming was always something we did here. We understand very clearly that the soil is what gives us an opportunity to have a career. We've been entirely no-till for the last 25 years. No-till has been just one of the basic greatest decisions we've ever made in terms of our operation. It's just been the perfect fit for us on our rolling acres here. I had done some research with Greg Olson on a different part of our farm, and he just brought up the idea of trying something new out here, and I'm always open to new ideas, and it sounded intriguing. So we started out with 3 prairie strips 4 years ago. They turned out really well. I like them for a number of reasons, and we added a 4th one 2 years ago, but they fit into our operation. They fit into our philosophy. They look nice, and they obviously do a job for us. They're all placed on slopes where we had issues with water flowing, and they're doing their job.
In general, based on some information that came out of Iowa State University, they talk about doing 10% of a field in prairie strips can get you up to 90% reduction in phosphorus loss. This farm has contours on it, so it was kind of an interesting concept for building this. A contour field is much smaller than your standard field because each individual contour is a field, right? So instead, we moved into a concept of let's look at 10% of the hillside, not the individual field. And then we moved into actually looking at how does it fit the operation. So on the 2 lower strips on the hillside we're on right now, we actually went into moving on the contour because that's the way they work this field. The field behind us actually has a strip that it's a rectangular field. And even though the contour is different, it was ran as a rectangle so that it made it easier for them to work around. And its design in width is actually a little bit bigger than these because Dan wanted to make it so that it fit sprayer widths.
There's no wasted efficiency there in terms of making it fit our equipment. So we have one that literally bisects that field by having 2/3 of the land above it, 1/3 below it. But again, it doesn't impede anything we do from a farming standpoint. And I think one of the things that works here is that these are placed very strategically in terms of the whole slope of the hill. So we have a strip that's maybe intercepting the slope at about 1/3 of its slope, and then one at 2/3 of its slope. So you've got two shots at slowing the water flow down before it hits the flatter bottomland. And one of the benefits of when we did what we did out here was that the area had been a soybean field, so there was no herbicide carryover. So we were able to plant oats and alfalfa around what was going to be the prairie strips. We didn't have to use any herbicides on their borders for the first 4 years now because they've been alfalfa fields. Eventually they'll rotate into cornfields, but I'm pretty good at keeping my sprayer where it belongs. So I don't think we'll put them at risk in the next year or two when we rotate out, but it'll be a consideration.
After we've laid out the strip, as Dan kind of stated, you know, the crop planting season is a little bit prior to the actual prairie planting season. So they will end up planting their crops, you know, around the strip that we've got marked off. That area we'll go in and we'll actually make sure that it doesn't have too much duff or surface cover on it, raking it, you know, cleaning it up, making sure that it actually gets good seed to soil surface contact for the seeder. Then we come in and we seed. Usually that's going to be late May, June. Early July is a little late, but we've done it and it works. If you're using a planting method with a drill, you're good, because that means you're actually putting it down in the soil. You're not going to go too deep. You're going to be less than 1/4 inch deep with this seed because it doesn't like to go deep in the ground. And that's another important factor. Some folks like to pound it a little too deep and then we run into problems. If you broadcast it, you want to roll it to push it into the soil. Because if you lay it just on the soil, wind can blow this stuff away. It's very soft, fluffy seed in a lot of cases. Now, the critical aspect that actually comes out of that is the maintenance those first 2 years. We want to cut it, you know, get in there with a mower and actually cut the whole entire thing at 8 inches the first year, 10 inches the second year, and we're going to cut it 2 to 3 times per year. Because what we're trying to do is at that point, the prairie is growing down first instead of up. We're trying to get rid of all the invasives and other problem things that are going to grow with it. We're not cutting the prairie because it's growing down.
Even though Greg said the plants are growing down, it did kind of bother me a little. I was going out there and cutting off what would have been seed heads on the newer plants. And I was like, I'm not sure that makes much sense to me, but it did in the long term, in that we got the weeds that we did not want to perish. And the prairie was just fine surviving that first year without maturing any seeds.
We are actually causing damage to some of the earlier successional prairie plants, but again, we know that works, and that's, you know, that's the critical factor is get rid of the weeds and allow the prairie to develop. Usually in year 3 on these things, they just pop up. Suddenly the prairie's there. And Dan can attest to that. That's exactly how it else. And it's there, you know, and that's what we expect. So those first 2 years are critical to keep that maintenance up.
We generally never use any insecticides, so that's not an issue. We will be careful when we use our herbicide spraying on them, but like I say, I had to spray next to neighbors' lawns, so I'm pretty good at making sure that I have the drift in the right direction and being careful with those sorts of things. I probably spent a half an hour this year on each of these prairie strips, just with a shovel, digging out a few things I didn't want in there. You'll get your random thistle and a burdock, and we found a few wild parsnips, but I don't want to say I'm obsessive, but I just don't like those things being allowed to grow to seed. So I just spend a little time popping them out of the ground.
And that's kind of an ongoing thing. After year 2, we stop the mowings and we go to spot control. Yeah, like Dan was talking about, exactly that is going out and removing the things we individually we don't want there anymore.
We have black-eyed Susans in here. This is bergamot. There's bees on it right now. We're getting the grasses to start establishing themselves, but the species that we want growing here are pretty well overtaking the strips now, and they're pretty well self-managing too. This is a good example of the undergrowth here. There's layers of canopy in this whole thing. There's a lot of grasses that are really just coming into their own this year, and they do start out under a canopy of other things. So that's kind of the fun of watching this evolve, just how that competition and the timing of all of it comes together. You'll see monarchs in here, you'll see cabbage butterflies, native bees, bumblebees, honeybees, a number of smaller insects that I can't name, but we had an entomologist out here a couple of years ago looking, and she was just beside herself with all the species she was seeing in here. It's pretty easy to see. If you walk right in there, the amount of insects is just phenomenal. They find this kind of an oasis, and even things like pheasants and such are finding this to be a good habitat for them too. As we all know, with the way farming is done now, fence rows are getting pulled out. There just isn't that much natural habitat anymore. And as a beekeeper, I understand that the lushness that the bees used to have 40 years ago when there were pastures and sweet clover and white clover by the acre. And in fact, people farmed sweet clover or white clover, for the bees to pollinate. That's just not there anymore. We're trying to put a little bit of that back in this system here, and it's showing up. There's a ton of insects in there, and some of those insects are actually beneficial to our agricultural crops too. We're going to see how that plays out when these move into corn and soybeans beside the pollinator strips. There's some documentation that with a soybean crop, honeybees can increase yield by 3 to 4 bushels. And it wouldn't be just honeybees that do that. These pollinators would do the same thing. So it may be in as a farmer's best interest to have more of those pollinators around too. I've never heard a negative comment about them at all, except for the first year when they were like, did your planter miss a spot? When they were still brown and everything else was greening up about them. But became pretty clear pretty soon in the second year that we had something going on here that was planned and not a planting mistake. They've been ideal. We agreed to hold these for 5 years, but I can pretty much guarantee you they will never leave the farm. They seem to have a very good evolutionary progression, so that as they mature, there'll be different species in here more than there are now, and that's fine. We'll have that's part of the interest I have in them, is just seeing how they do evolve over the years. So it's been kind of a fun experiment for us.
All right. So let's jump right into Q&A, and Greg and Dan, if you can make yourselves visible and hearable. There we go. The first question we have is, what prairie plant species are you seeding there?
Well, the short answer is it's massively diverse. Dan's farm actually had 33 species in it. There were 9 grasses, forbs, and sedges, grasses, sedges, and rushes, and 24 forbs in there. This was a monarch mix, so it was, kind of heavy on 3 different types of milkweeds and some rattlesnake master, then mixed in with just a diversity of other things. Like I said, I could read you the whole list, but I don't think we really want to get into that right now. We just wanted to make sure we had good diversity and we're meeting that monarch goal.
And I'll make a real quick statement here. We actually referenced the Tallgrass Prairie Center at Iowa and their seed calculator to give us kind of a rough cut of where to start with the seed mix. And then we worked with the seed vendor in Wisconsin, as Greg knows, to kind of customize that. But I just wanted to pitch that resource, especially for those in Iowa, the seed calculator at Tallgrass Prairie Center. All right, a question here. Have you noticed less water flowing off the field since you've had these strips established?
Well, it's a little hard to ascertain specifically that they are doing that. I can tell you that we're having less issues on the flatland down below in terms of any kind of gully creation. One of the things I wanted to impress on people is that this practice alone is not, curative. You need to bundle it with other things. And obviously you saw in our picture, alfalfa above and below it, that just happened to be how the rotation figured out. But we also employ no-till and obviously contours. So this to me is an additive practice that just embellishes what you've done before, but you can't just presume that it's one singular thing that's going to cure all your ills. I will say though that we have seen extremely low amounts of either soil damming up below it or water moving. And, that's specifically what we want. Our soil on our farm is our goal.
Okay. I'm going to ask you to elaborate on one thing about the season of seeding. So these were both the 2 years you seeded, you did it in June. And our next farm we're going to hear from did a late fall seeding. So can you elaborate a little bit on the sort of window of opportunity you had for spring seeding, and then also how you used oats as a nurse crop as well?
Yeah, I'll let Greg elaborate a little bit. I do say it was a little unnerving the first year when we were planting them, because we're out in May doing all of our stuff, and Greg is telling us June 15th is their target date, and I'm worried about weeds building up and everything. But Greg was right. He planted there are a lot of warm season grasses in there, and June 15th or so was a good time to be putting them in. So what my normal brain would have been thinking about getting planting in early May for us wasn't really the correct way to go. I'll let Greg elaborate on the rest of it though.
So adding the oats in as a nurse crop, that first year the prairie is not going to really grow that effectively, just because it needs time to start getting itself germinated and then moving, and it's growing down as well as up, and it's spending time going down. So having a nurse crop there to actually help protect the soil and also help to control some of the invasives that might come in is why we go with the oats. Roughly about a bushel per acre of oats is what we put down as a nurse crop.
And I want to elaborate on, folks saw a picture of a regular tractor with a seed drill, and then they saw a video of an ATV pulling a smaller seed drill. And actually those were the 2 different years. Maybe you could elaborate a little bit on the 2 different methods, and what have you seen, if you noticed any difference from the type of drill used?
Yeah, so the first 3 strips that went in on Dan's farm were done with the standard, it was a Great Plains drill, no-till, native seed drill. So this is, basically a full-size drill that everybody's used to seeing for this type of work. The 4th strip, to kind of cut down on cost, we worked with Wings Over Wisconsin, and they had Casco ATV. It's still a no-till native seed drill. It's got the 3 hoppers break up for the different seed types. But it is, it looks a little, it can be a little disconcerting to folks who've been doing this for years with a larger drill. I was a little bit concerned after the year 2, because it didn't look like it was going as fast as year 2 from the Great Plains drill. But this year, and I think Dan would attest to this too, the thing did what it was supposed to in its 3rd year. It popped. So no complaints.
I think that's one thing new farmers have to understand about this, is the first year it's going to look pretty sad. The 2nd year and the 3rd year, it just pops. It's kind of amazing how you think. I called Greg up actually after the 1st year and said, I think we're going to have to replant these. And he said, just be patient. And he was correct. You've seen the videos there. They're just solid now, but it takes a bit of time and a little trust on the part of the farmer to know that the process does work.
Okay. All right. And now we have 2 backed up questions in the Q&A, but I do want to jump to the next farm, so we make sure we stay within our hour, and still we'll get back to Q&A after that. So thank you both, Greg and Dan, and you guys too can stay on after 9 if folks want to continue with questions. I'm going to try to very quickly here get to the next video of Hammer and Kavazanjian Farm. And let me share my screen. Sorry for a bit of a second here, I need. Okay, here we go.
This is Hammer and Kavazanjian Farms, and it is a Wisconsin crop farm. We grow corn for grain, we grow soybeans, some of which are tofu, edible soybeans, and we grow small grains, mostly winter wheat, but we're now trying to get some barley into our rotation.
So basically, our farming operation consists of approximately 1,900 acres. We were one of the first ones that were doing strip till. We've went through various configurations of equipment, trying to obtain a strip till practice or no-till practice that would fit our expectations. We finally are starting to see some of the results here, and we're finally seeing equipment that can do the job what we want it to do.
I'm an independent crop consultant. I've been working with them for many crop seasons, and I'm the eyes in the field for the most part. And prior to putting in the prairie strips, Charlie and Nancy have been participating in the CSP program since its inception. And one of the practices that they've incorporated has been the Pollinator Habitat. And I believe there's somewhere around 15 or 16 acres of pollinator habitat scattered throughout the farm on various knobs and corners and things like that.
We have tried prairie before. We're not pros at it by any means, but we started growing some pollinator habitat 5 years ago. And we did it because we have areas of our field that aren't very productive. So we have a mix of flowers and grasses that are perennials. I think we're in our 5th year now. The first year we did it, it looked terrible. And we thought, oh, what do we get ourselves into? But by the 3rd year, when we saw a field of yellow flowers, we were both so excited, taking pictures and, you know, just so excited how beautiful it is.
That kind of opened the door for us to segue into prairie strips and get into this whole idea of using the prairie itself as a conservation practice, specifically for soil conservation in this case. I take on the role of, hey, I see a resource issue out here. Let's talk about it, see what we can do to address it. We had both sheet and some rill erosion, and occasionally we got into some early gullies. And we've been talking about for probably a decade now, what can we do? How are we going to address it? We're doing no-till or strip-till on this farm, and we still have the problem. Perennial vegetation would be a best practice that we could look at.
And I give Bill credit. He walks and knows our farms quite well. And so with his ability to kind of consult and say, if we're going to move forward, we had to come up with some strategies. And this looked like the best option out here.
What kind of pushed it into the forefront more is we had some pretty high rainfall years back in 2013, 14, and our headlands really had some serious erosion on them, where we were going up and down the slope on the property line. I welcomed the obstacle myself. One of the practices I was looking to incorporate on that specific site was contour planting. And that has been a tough nut to crack. And it's not unusual, you know, with 24 row, 60-foot planting equipment, contour planting gets to be a challenge. We've had a couple of things come together on the farm. We've updated planting equipment, so we have individual row by row population and shut-off control. Also did some updates on the sprayer, so we have nozzle by nozzle control for shutoffs. And now we're starting to put some pieces of the puzzle together that have been a real challenge for contouring and point rows and all those types of issues. What we did in terms of layout, we have 2 individual contours addressing different slopes in the field, 2 connected drumlins, and they're 60 feet wide, following the contour pretty closely. They're just wrapping. We have approximately 4 or 5 acres in one strip and a couple acres in the other. And the process was the simple flagging, taking the tape, measuring out, old school style of laying out a contour. We worked with NRCS and they came out, laid out the contour lines, and we adjusted them a little bit so we could handle the radiuses that were laid out with the planting equipment. It was in December. We were doing it at that point because we wanted to make sure we were getting our seed on the surface. We had a drill that was equipped to handle the prairie seeds. We wanted to do it when it was frozen, so we weren't burying things too deep. We were successful in that regard. One thing we didn't anticipate was the inability to see the drill marks after the first contour was planted. The operator was pulling his hair out, so we ended up flagging every pass. So he had something to guide him as he went through the process. We used a very old tie drill, which was equipped with a specialty seed box for the fluffy prairie grasses primarily, as well as a three bin drill. The prairie seed bin, conventional fluted small grain bin, and then we had the small seed hopper, which is typically used for alfalfa seeding and things like that. We had to do some modifications on the drill itself to get the right gearing and ratios to get the rates we were after, but spent a day in the shop getting everything calibrated and ready to go, and then hit the field. We saw the utility that we could potentially get in a conservation practice like this by having native species as well, which are highly competitive, deeply rooted, also provide an abundance of insect diversity. Going forward, we will have our guidance paths and things like that incorporated into that prairie strip planting so that we know we will be turning off the planting and application equipment as we cross the prairie strip itself. Some of it will be exclusion, some of it will simply be turning off the equipment and driving through. It'll be a combination of different operations. But so far, so good on our first pass of going through with any pesticides this year. We were also able to utilize that same process when we were fertilizing this year as well. As we go forward, we'll just refine it and get better at it. And hopefully, this will be the groundwork that we'll utilize for incorporating more contour planting and things like that, contour operations on the farm going forward.
So there's been a lot of advances with technology that makes this job, it's going to be easier. It's not real easy, otherwise everybody would be doing it right. But it's a challenge, there's no question about it, but we think we're up to the task. The old adage is walk before you run. So this is a good opportunity to walk into it.
Oh, we probably have farmer neighbors that think we're a little crazy sometimes, but we talk to all those farmers. We've had them here for field days. They've walked our fields, and my husband talks to a lot of farmers, and I talk to a lot of farmers. So maybe some of them do think we're crazy, but it doesn't bother us, and maybe a few of them have learned something from us, I hope.
Well, I think the interaction with somebody that's done it or working with it is probably the biggest assistance that can happen here. Just look at the group that we got. There were a lot of people are coming on board. They want to learn, but they're a little skeptical too of what's out there.
The farm groups like we're dealing with in Dodge County, or our Dodge County Farmers Group, is very hungry for additional practices. Everybody that I encounter who's farming has something that they want to do on their operation. And it's a matter of having the venue to have the conversation. And that's what the farmer group has allowed us to do quite well.
Most people don't probably have the ability to lean on, like Bill, to ask advice or to come up with some ideas. If I didn't have the ability to lean on Bill on a few things, there's no place to go, really.
The utility of this practice in terms of its effect on a small watershed and within this field, for example, the science behind it for phosphorus and sediment reduction is solid. I look at the data set that's been generated out of Iowa State, and there's some good numbers there, good science. And it gives me as an advisor more confidence in going forward and saying, hey, we can get some mileage out of this that goes beyond just the strip itself.
All right, thank you very much, Bill, Charlie, and Nancy, for that great video production. I'm going to ask one question to follow up, because I don't think it was fully explained in the video. Is we saw where wheat had been planted, where soybeans had planted, and in between that, the prairie strips had been planted, and then the crops had been clipped. Maybe one of you can just do a real run through of what happened there, so we all are clear from what the video showed us.
I'll pipe in here. This field typically is farmed as one unit. Just so happened in 2019, we were trying out a malting barley enterprise, trying to get something going, and we happened to split the field. This year it was winter wheat and soybeans, and so you can see the corner of the strip, we had soybeans planted, and we also had some very different responses in terms of establishment and the different crops as well. And specifically, things got off to a fast, quick start in the soybean side, and in the wheat portion of the field, things are considerably slower.
In terms of the prairie growth, in terms
Correct.
of native seed growth underneath, yep. Okay. I'm going to combine a couple of Q&A questions here about soil quality. And Tim, if you want to jump in here, you could chime in too. The first question is, do these prairie strips improve soil quality? And I'll relate this to another question, that is, we talked about if you were to eventually terminate a mature prairie strip and move it up or down the slope or replant it, what would you see in terms of differences in soil quality where the prairie strips previously had existed for several years?
Yeah, those are great questions. And I'll start with the caveat that I am not a soil scientist, so I can't speak specifically about the microbes and what's going on under the soil. But I know there are folks at Iowa State in the agronomy department, and then at the ag department at the University of Michigan State, that are looking at the communities of microbial microscopic stuff that's in the soil that has all kinds of benefits. And what we've seen is the community really changes underneath the prairie strip. And we're still waiting to see how long that stays around in the soil afterwards. So yes, the prairie strips are absolutely going to improve the soil. You know, you have improved infiltration. I mean, more water just goes into the prairie strip, and that's where we talk about the less water coming off the field. I mean, most of it, it's just kind of being sucked down into the prairie strip there. So you have more infiltration, the bulk density is better, and there's just a lot of benefits. But I can't speak real specifically to some of that stuff, just because I don't know what I'm talking about. Maybe even Bill would be better to talk about some of that stuff. But just you can, again, I'd reference the website and look at some of those peer-reviewed papers that are available.
Yeah, I guess I don't have anything to add to that. It's typical scenario. You provide perennial vegetation. We tend to see a real shift in some of the microfauna that we're dealing with, and we tend to see an increase in those species as we provide perennial vegetation. It's pretty consistent.
And here's a somewhat related question asking, have you used cover crops on the farm? And if so, how do these compare from a soil conservation standpoint? And I think we're referencing, like, once you have the established prairie strips over time, how would that compare to using cover crops in the field? Well, first, actually, Charlie and Nancy, maybe explain a little bit about your experience with cover crops, and then we can relate it to prairie strips.
Well, we're very familiar with cover crops. We've incorporated them into a lot of our small grains. We've experienced trying to establish covers in corn using aerial application, and we had limited success on that. It's the sunlight factor that really is a detriment to trying to establish in fall. But with the small grains, we've incorporated clover. We've incorporated some other species at early spring, frost seeded them in. So this particular field has had clover in a cover crop, and other, I believe, going back, Bill, you can maybe address, historically, we've had a lot of cover crops on this farm.
Yeah, I think cover crops are a complementary component of the equation here in a conservation planning system. I think Dan pointed that out real well in the previous discussion. The prairie strip itself is one more tool in the toolbox, and in terms of utility, this is really amping up the benefits that we see out of a continuous vegetation system compared to an annual cover crop. You know, this is strategically placed that in a manner that goes above and beyond what we're going to achieve with a cover crop system.
Yeah, we did this specifically to address that erosion issue on that farm. So yeah, we've used cover crops for probably 15 years or so. Charlie really likes the tillage radishes a lot, but we like a variety of a mix in our cover crops.
Yeah, and part of the reason we have this site selected, this site was, the soil was scalped here 18 years ago, I believe, when the county highway was rebuilt. And that process, if anyone's ever dealt with scalped soil, and we call made land, I guess, the recovery of that is slow and very challenging. And our infiltration dynamics have changed dramatically from that operation. And that's why we're having runoff issues on this farm. So, you know, it's strategic placement because of some history here. So it suits the site quite well.
And to elaborate, Bill, you're saying they scraped the topsoil off, they borrowed a lot of material underneath that for the roadbed, and then they pushed the topsoil back over, and it wasn't the same, of course, after that, and you've been battling infiltration, and you know, you got the no-till going on and everything else, but you need additional practices to deal with that issue, right?
Well said, Craig.
Okay. Hey, it's I'll tell you what, it's 8:59, and I want to put up the screen for the crop consultants to be able to use their QR code. So if you're a certified crop advisor and you have the QR scanner, please go ahead right now. I'll leave this up for a little bit here. If you can't use that, you can go ahead and just type your name and CCA number in the chat, and we'll save all that, or you can email it to me at that email address right there. And maybe Heidi, if you can put that in the chat too, they could click directly on that. We have at least 1 or 2 more questions to answer, and it's 9 o'clock, but almost 9 o'clock, but we're all going to stay on the line here, and I welcome everybody who wants to stick with us for some additional Q&A. And for those who need to jump off, thank you very much for joining. I should probably mention real quick, Tim, I noticed that Iowa State has the recorded video series on their website now, and there is a way to do a self-paced test out for CEU credits for crop advisors as well. Do you want to mention that real quick?
Yeah, thanks, Craig. That's a great reminder. If you work your way over to the Prairie Strips website, you just Google Prairie Strips, put that into your search browser. Yeah, there's a series of videos and then some small online tests that you can take to become a certified Prairie Strip consultant, I believe is what we were calling it. So if you're interested in getting some CEUs and learning more about prairie and prairie strips specifically, yeah, I would encourage you to look at some of those videos.
All right, very good. Okay, here's an important question. Now we're going to continue with Q&A as long as people want to throw them at us. Instead of burning prairie strips, can or have you mowed or baled for forage?
Yep, I'll jump on that one. So the initial research study was at the Neil Smith National Wildlife Refuge, and all I'll say is it's a challenge to get something burned on federal land, just because there's a lot of boxes that you have to tick to get things in place. So it was a lot more convenient for the farmer that was managing that land to bale and then use that material for forage for his cattle. So I saw there was a question about, burn restrictions and what if you can't burn, the closest thing that you can do would be to cut and then remove that material at the end of the season. So again, I'm not saying just to mow and leave that material there, but cut and then take all of that material that you cut off the site. That's going to be the closest thing to simulate a burn. Again, I would always say that the burn's going to be better, and there is some science to when you burn and what species that you're trying to get rid of. But in terms of getting rid of trees, things like that, burns are always going to be the best. But yeah, mowing and baling can also be a pretty good second choice.
Okay.
Just be aware, some of our strips are in the CRP, so I don't know if they're going to let us bale it.
Yeah, Nancy, that's a really, really good point. So I know with the prairie strips practice specifically, and it might be different from state to state and from county to county, you can maybe do some mowing and some haying on those strips, but it's on the order of having to pay back maybe 50% of the contract for that year. So whatever payments that you received for that, you'd have to pay half of that back if you were gonna, say, graze them or bale it or whatever. So certainly check with whatever the language is if you're in a CRP contract, and talk to your local USDA office if you want to apply for a variance. I know on my family's land, we've had CRP that we've burned outside of the mid-contract maintenance, and generally the USDA is pretty open to allowing variances. It's just keep communication open with them.
And I'll also invite Dan to chime in if he wants to on plans for future maintenance, mowing, or even baling, if that's in the works there. To elaborate on the CRP2, I wanted to acknowledge that the CP15 practice, right, is what Charlie and Nancy, what you used. And that was, you know, last year before there was this new CP43 prairie strips practice that's now new this year. All right. I have a question here about if there's areas of the field where you increase the amount of prairie to address the higher surface water flow rate, then do you adjust the seeding rate or prep that area differently than the rest of the prairie strips to account for the higher flow rate to improve establishment? So sorry, Dan, I know you just jumped on. I'll go ahead. Let's continue with this question first about varying seeding rates, or maybe Tim, we could elaborate on varying width as well of prairie strips where necessary.
Yeah, so I'll talk about both of those things real quick. And again, every site is going to be different, and me just kind of talking at my computer screen, I'm probably not going to give you like the best advice necessarily. But one thing that I would say, if you have an area that's pretty sloped or you're worried about water flow, what Greg was mentioning with using a nurse crop with that prairie seed. So depending upon the time of year, using oats, using winter wheat, putting some kind of a nurse crop in with that prairie that will germinate quickly, and then that will keep that seed from sliding around. That's something I would really encourage, versus, again, your prairie is going to be much more expensive than something like a nurse crop. So just getting some of that, the nurse crop species established, that will help hold that soil in place and allow the prairie to establish better.
Yeah, I'd add to that, you know, be very prescriptive with what you're using for the specific site. As a general suggestion, we had winter wheat seeded here, and the entire field was planted with the intent of it being grain production, or at a rate for grain production, and it was higher than what we would want to see for a nurse crop or companion crop environment. So pay close attention to what you're doing for the site. And competition here can be a real challenge, especially a crop like wheat or rye. That's much more aggressive than a light seeding of oats or something like that.
Great, Dan, I'm going to jump back to our prior question now that you're on the line with us regarding mowing, or maybe even baling and using for forage the strips. Do you have any, what are your plans?
Yeah, that's nothing we've ever really discussed. I honestly would not see a purpose to think about burning. They seem to be so well self-managed that I'm not sure that we would have an issue, and Greg might want to address that, but that never even crossed my mind that we'd have to manage them in that way. The only thing I had a little concern about, and that's purely aesthetics, is that for the first month in spring, you've got all the old standing and, you know, dead plants from the prior year, and just to make them look nice, I'm thinking about just rolling those strips once, just to knock that dead stuff flat so it doesn't look quite so homely for a little bit, but that would be only for aesthetics. But Greg has a comment, but we've never talked about burning, and I wouldn't see the need, at least from the perspective of what we're doing right now.
Yeah, whenever we discuss burning with these, with the strips that I've been working with, we're always looking at what are the potential downfalls or a possibility of the burn getting away from you. Standard things you're going to talk about with the burn. The size of the strip sometimes makes it so that it seemed like it'd be an easy burn, but it sometimes is not. As for, you know, getting into the other question, the main one with the forage, I'm working with 2 other farms right now that have prairie strips, and actually one is we're putting in a summer slump prairie forage area. So the one farm, which is in southern Fond du Lac County here in Wisconsin, he's actually going to be harvesting it for forage for some grass-fed beef. And then this other organic farm over in Green Lake County here in Wisconsin, that one we're building an actual summer slump grazing area. so, you know, any of you who know anything about grazing, they're of course the cool seasons start falling off a little bit during those hot months. And having the prairie being in its prime growth during that time, that allows for that, you know, that summer slump, move them over and put them in there. So, you know, we're discussing all these different options, but I can say we're still in our infancy at looking at them. So I can't say I have any really good understanding or data as to what's going to happen with it, but we're trying to figure it out.
I'll just make one comment too on a previous issue about mowing and such. The strips that we put on were not part of a USDA program. They were done by ourselves earlier, so we have basically unlimited flexibility in what we do with them because there is no contract. And that might be something people want to think about too, is do the risks of getting some cost sharing outweigh the benefits of being able to be a little more versatile with what you do with them? You know, it's just something to weigh in your head when you're thinking about the whole process.
And I'll ask a related question, and Tim, you can maybe give update from Iowa. Has anyone integrated livestock for grazing once or twice a year, and can grazing be a replacement for mowing or burning?
So we haven't seen any grazing in the season with the prairie strips, but we've got several sites where once the crop has been harvested, then cattle are let out onto the field. And, you know, we've seen that, but again, logistically, I'm not quite sure. Just with the shape of the strips, you'd either have to have some kind of virtual fencing, or you'd have to get out with some type of electric fencing if you're going to do that in the season while you know, while the crop is still standing. So we haven't seen that yet. It would be possible, you know, as Greg was mentioning. I mean, you get, you know, July, August. I mean, this stuff is really green. There's a lot of biomass out there. It could serve some value as potential grazing. But again, with that, if you had a really nice stand of prairie and then you get a big rainstorm, you get a bunch of cattle mucking around out there, it would be really possible to create kind of a mud hole, and then maybe you have a bunch of thistles or something invade what was once kind of a nice prairie. So if you're going to do any grazing, it would be just all about management, putting them on and taking them off at the appropriate time.
Yeah, I'm speaking about more than I know, but the thought just occurred to me about whether there are some plants in the mix that would have toxicity issues. I don't know, but that would certainly be something you'd have to pay attention to if you did think about grazing.
Yeah, Dan, and that's a good point. I will say that with the summer slump grazing operation, our field I'm looking at, we are going through and checking first of all, what is the feed value of the different plants, and then also the ones that could possibly be toxic. Because there are certain plants that might not be healthy for the animal to eat. So it creates a specialized mix kind of concept. So.
There was another question related to habitat, and we spoke about pollinators and small animals. There's a question related to hunting and possibility of attracting predators to the system. I think that's kind of interesting. One thing that we've experienced on Charlie and Nancy's farm over the years with having a lot of long-term no-till is we have some areas where we have considerable ground squirrel activity, and anyone who's been involved with no-till for long-term, you know it can be a problem. Recent years it's been less of a problem because of high rainfall, but this particular farm, we've had ground squirrel issues for decades. And one thing I'm hopeful of is this habitat. We've got 60-foot wide strips here. Great hunting opportunity for someone who's interested in the way it wraps around the landscape. But we do have predation that is happening in these ground squirrel burrows. And specifically, I did see some happening this spring or summer within the strip itself. It's not because it's established, but it's coincidental. but hopefully we can have coyote or fox including this field in their hunting rituals and as they traverse across the landscape. I'm optimistic that this is going to create a corridor for predation, and that can only help our situation that we're dealing with in the fields.
My experience has been that there's they make a pretty nice pheasant refuge. We've flushed a number of them out as I've been going through there, but it's the kind of ideal habitat they like, and it just gives them a little hiding spot in what sometimes is a pretty barren topography.
Yeah, I've seen the same thing on the prairie plantings, the pollinator habitat that we have across the farm. What I like about this is it probably provides a little more pleasurable hunting experience. You've got a nice meandering contour going across a drumlin, a little more fulfilling than walking over to a little corner of a field that you might get with just the pollinator habitat that we've got scattered.
And on the habitat theme, there was a question, Tim, during your presentation we didn't get to, and it's just in general, what kind of data do we have on biodiversity and especially pollinators? I know Iowa State's doing a lot. Could you elaborate a little bit on some of the research?
Yeah, and just because I can or whatever, Bill, I'll address that, what we were talking about with hunting just there. You know, we've had a lot of the farmers that we work with, you have, you know, 2 guys and a dog, and it's just perfect walking across these prairie strips. You know, it's like you can kind of cover the whole thing, and it's a really pleasurable hunting experience. And I think that the prairie strips could be, yeah, just kind of a really good way, since we're, like Dan mentioned, where some of those fence lines are obviously not there anymore. This can be a really, really good way to get some of that habitat back. And it's really slick to walk along and hunt some of these strips. It's a really good place to find, you know, pheasants, and then depending upon where you're at here in the state, you know, maybe quail or grouse or some of those other things. In terms of the other habitat stuff, I know we're finding an increased amount of both the native bees and then things like ground beetles, things like that. I know that those are really being looked at in systems that have prairie strips and systems that don't. I can't speak specifically off the top of my head about numbers. I just know that we've seen an increase in species richness and an increase in overall amount of those native bees. And I know just from one of my associates, one of the entomologists on the prairie strips team, Dr. Matt O'Neill, they actually found in the control fields that had no prairie strips, they found more common milkweed stems, but then in the fields with prairie strips actually found many more adult monarchs. So even though you have more common milkweed, which is a weed, which will show up in the ditches, show up in the waterways, the monarchs need all these other nectaring plants to eat. So it's like they're choosing to come to these prairie species and hanging out there. So I know just across the board, the numbers are higher, I guess, for the pollinators. And those would be things I would just, again, encourage you to look at the website. There's information that's already out and then will be coming out over the next couple of years, peer-reviewed scientific publications where you can look at all the graphs and the data.
Yeah, that's interesting regarding the monarchs, because I've been paying a little attention to the milkweed stuff around here too. And being a beekeeper, you pay attention to nectar flows, and the window for milkweed nectar in terms of the monarchs is really pretty short. So they do depend on a lot of the other species to maintain food source over the whole summer. So a variety of forbs in a prairie strip like this is something that monarchs really need. Obviously, we know milkweed is important to them, but they do need nectar sources for the entire length of their stay here.
All right, I see only like one last question that we haven't at least touched on in some way. It's a question about infiltration in the prairie strips, which we haven't talked about much. Difference between, say, brome versus prairie species in regards to, well, waterway usage. If I'm understanding, maybe related to infiltration and ultimately flow rates over the land of different grass species.
Yeah, again, there was a good thesis that was released a couple of years ago from one of the ag engineers at Iowa State that spoke about this issue. Essentially, you think about the brome roots being about 18 inches deep, and then some of those, big blue stem roots maybe going as deep as 8 or 10 feet. You're just going to have more of those macro pores, more of those holes. There's going to be just more underground activity under that prairie strip, creating just a lot more pathways for that water to get down into the soil than what you'd have with brome.
Yeah, it's kind of an additive thing because not only do you have those roots there, but you have accumulated on top a fair amount of trash and plants. So not only are you increasing the filtration, but you're decreasing the lateral velocity of any water that's flowing. So it's an additive process there.
Yeah, Dan, that's a really good point. So a lot of that, you mentioned how it can kind of look a little homely in the spring, but you have all that thatch and all that material that's basically acting as a gigantic sponge that's just really soaking up a lot of that rainfall and soaking up a lot of that overland flow.
Yeah, and that's why in my mind, I wouldn't want to burn that because I want to keep that there to do its job. And if you burn that, you're just eliminating that thatch as a factor in slowing down lateral velocity, in my opinion.
I think it's also important to consider what the specific use of the practice is. Using prairie plants in a grass waterway, which is what the question was asking about, it does create some challenges related to having a bunch type species in a grass waterway may not be the best selection. It's very, if you're holding soil in place in a channel of water conveyance, some prairie species would probably result in a very severely damaged waterway early in that establishment phase. So you need to be very prescriptive in terms of where you're putting the prairie species and when they get introduced into a conservation structure itself, like a grassed waterway. It's just make sure you're dealing with the right species for the location is the take home there.
There's also a question here, Tim, you could elaborate, have these been installed on tiled fields?
Yep, they have. Again, we're not asking the folks to do anything different on the fields where we're installing prairie strips, and these are large conventional farms. That's another question that we get a lot. Well, these are deep, thick roots, so obviously this is going to be a problem with tile. For the last several years, we've been taking lighted USB cameras and putting them in perforated tile, under mature prairie, under triticale, under continuous corn, under corn soybean rotations, and just kind of seeing what's going on there. And we've seen some root infiltration kind of in all of those systems, but nothing that would create real blockages. I think what we've seen, and there's a really good video on our website that we produced a few years ago that shows some of these systems. Probably the biggest thing that we've seen, and again, every site's going to be different, but depending upon how that tile is bedded, if it's not quite flat and you've got a real low spot that has water sitting in it for extended periods of time, those tend to be areas that can have problems. With the prairie, we've seen where you'll get, cottonwoods or dogwoods or willows, some of these tree species that come in, those roots are going to penetrate, through the perforations into that black plastic tile and then begin to expand and cause problems. So tree species, woody species can be a problem, more so than the prairie. But it's amazing to me that in a continuous cornfield, you see relatively the same amount of roots in a black plastic tile that's buried about 4 feet deep than what you would see in under a mature prairie.
Yeah, and one of my sites in particular, Tim, I specifically moved the strips so that they were in between the tile, not putting them over the tile, because this was a shallow rooted, or a shallow tile system, and I just was too concerned about getting too much of the root mass into that tile system. So, like you said, conditional. You got to look at the system and what's happening with it.
Yep, and there are a lot of products now, that you could either put a non-perforated tile, or there's sleeves that you can put over that perforated tile. If you were going to be in a situation where you were installing new tile through some kind of a prairie situation, you could always just err on the side of safety, like either stay out of that area or get some kind of a sleeve to go over that tile when you install it. I mean, it's not that much of an added expense.
And Craig, I'm sorry, I was muted before and I was trying to answer the waterway question. May I throw in a couple comments here?
Go ahead.
So I've recommended to a couple of the folks I work with that you can use this in place of a waterway if you're at the beginning stages of the need for a waterway. If there's heavy gully erosion already, I would not recommend putting in prairie strips to deal with it. You need to have the grassed waterway for that particular situation. But if you're starting with sheet and rill that's turning into gully, you might be able to get away with taking the energy out of the water and, doing away with having to have the waterway, which of course is a feature that farmers get annoyed by because they have to lift up to go over them. Yep. And to Bill, you actually covered it pretty well, and you did earlier too, Tim. The prairie species are very stiff-stemmed, and a grassed waterway is a conveyance. The prairie strip is designed to actually slow or take energy out of the water. So you're looking at two different kind of purposes here, in that the grassed waterway wants to slow it down so it doesn't erode the grassed waterway, but it still wants to move the water. The prairie strip is more about causing more of an impediment to the water movement. So putting prairie species into the grassed waterway is going to create possible ponding areas in the grassed waterway, which you do not want. So yeah, so the two practices have to be kind of looked at a little bit differently if you're going to try to work them together. I wouldn't say build a prairie strip and then run this prairie up and down the waterway. I'd leave the grassed waterway in that fall down grass concept that is designed to allow for the conveyance of the water.
And just to reiterate, I know sometimes we talk about replacing waterways with strips, and we're not talking about putting prairie in the footprint of where a waterway would be. We're talking about prairies on the contour. Yep. That would thus reduce the need to then have a waterway. So, I'm going to wrap up our Q&A. I welcome anybody to have any last words if they want to share anything else on the panel. Well, with that, thank you very much. Thank you especially Charlie and Nancy and to Dan that you offer your farms for these practices. And thank you to Bill and Greg for all your assistance with the farms and getting them installed, and to Tim and everyone on this very impressive team of researchers and practitioners at Iowa State. I encourage everyone to go to the Iowa State STRIP site, reference the literature, reference the outreach and the workshops they're doing, and we'll see if we can grow this practice more, especially that now we have a CRP option, which I know the state of Iowa is utilizing quite a lot. And we encourage folks in Wisconsin to investigate the CP43 practice to get land rental and establishment support for the prairie strips as well. So thank you, everybody.
Can I make just one comment?
Yes, please.
And this hasn't been talked about, but I think prairie strips also are one outward example for non-farmers to understand that we actually pay attention to things on the farm. I've had numerous people who have no idea what they're for and have very little knowledge of farming, but they'll ask me what those are. It's a great opportunity to explain not only what they are and do, but also, infer that we give a damn about what we have on our land and why we have it there, and that we actually do care for our land. So they're a good PR piece too. And, we don't think a lot of times about PR in terms of non-farmers, but it's important. They'll drive by and then see them in the grocery store and they say, what are those? And it's a great teaching opportunity.
Yep. And I can attest at Sand County Foundation, we get a lot of interest on social media and elsewhere from folks who, you know, aren't full-time farmers or crop consultants about this as well. So, all right, thank you everybody for your time and for going over with us. So we'll let you get back to all your work, and we'll keep in touch. Thank you very much.
Great.
Thanks. It's
Thank
been
you.
fun.
Thank you.